Welcome to the Alpha Mediumship Academy podcast, a space for intuition, mediumship, and spiritual growth. I'm Joy L, and each week we explore conscious development, awareness, and the deeper side of spiritual experience. So, wherever you are, settle in and let's begin. Welcome to the Alpha Mediumship Academy podcast, a space for intuition, mediumship, awareness, and spiritual growth. I'm Joyelle, and each week we explore perception, consciousness, and development in a grounded, thoughtful, and very human way. And I think today's topic is one of those things that almost everyone in spiritual development quietly deals with, even if they don't always say it out loud. Doubt, self-doubt, that internal hesitation that shows up even when something feels clear, even when something feels real, even when you know something on some level, and still find yourself questioning it afterward. And what's interesting is that this doesn't just happen to beginners, it happens to very sensitive people, very intuitive people, very aware people, sometimes even more as they develop, not less, which is a bit counterintuitive, no pun intended, because you would think that becoming more aware would automatically make you more confident. But in reality, awareness often increases the amount you can perceive before it increases the amount you trust what you're perceiving. And that gap between perception and trust is where doubt lives. And I remember this phase very clearly in my own experience, where I would sense something internally, quite clearly actually, and then immediately begin the internal process of, okay, but is that real? Or am I interpreting that? Or am I projecting? Or am I just emotionally activated right now? And suddenly, what was a simple moment of awareness becomes a full internal investigation. And honestly, sometimes that investigation is happening while you're just trying to live your normal life. Like you're in the middle of making coffee and your mind is simultaneously questioning reality, which feels slightly dramatic when you say it out loud. But I think a lot of people will relate to that more than they admit. And I think one of the reasons this happens is because spiritual awareness doesn't arrive in a perfectly organized way. It doesn't come labeled. It doesn't come with instructions. It doesn't come with confirmation built in. It just appears in awareness. And then your mind tries to make sense of it after the fact. And depending on your personality, your nervous system, your emotional history, your sensitivity, that interpretation process can either feel relatively smooth or it can feel like a very loud internal committee meeting where nobody agrees on anything. So today, I want to talk about why that happens, why doubt forms, why it persists, and why, in many cases, it actually increases the more sensitive and aware you become, at least initially, before it starts to soften. Because it does soften, but not in the way people expect, and not as quickly as people want. So let's start here. Doubt is not random, it's structured. It usually forms from three main places in spiritual development: sensitivity, interpretation overload, lack of external validation. And those three together create a very specific internal experience. Because when you're sensitive, you notice more. When you notice more, you have more internal data. When you have more internal data, your mind tries to interpret more. And when there's no immediate external confirmation of that interpretation, The mind hesitates, and that hesitation becomes doubt. And I think people often misunderstand doubt as a flaw, but most of the time, it's actually a processing state. It's the mind saying, I don't have enough external confirmation to settle this yet. The problem is when it becomes chronic, when instead of temporary hesitation, it becomes a default response. And I think a lot of spiritual people accidentally train themselves into doubt without realizing it because they feel something, then immediately override it, or wait for someone else to confirm it, or dismiss it because it doesn't feel certain enough. And over time, the system learns we don't trust the first signal, even when that first signal is often the clearest one. And that's where we're going to go next. But before we do, I want to slow this down even more in the next section, because this is where it really becomes personal for most people. Because doubt isn't just theoretical, it shows up in real moments, in real decisions, in real emotional experiences, and in how people start to disconnect from their own internal clarity without even realizing it. So let's bring this out of theory for a second, because doubt doesn't usually show up as some big philosophical idea. It shows up in a very normal, very human moments. Like you feel something, you sense something, and for a split second, it's clear, not dramatic, just clear. And then almost immediately after that clarity arrives, another layer kicks in. Okay, but I am sure about that. And it's that after moment where things start to shift. And I think this is really important to understand because most people assume doubt means I didn't perceive anything clearly. But that's not what's actually happening. A lot of the time, you did perceive something clearly. The doubt comes in after, during interpretation, during reflection, during the mind trying to categorize what just happened. And I remember noticing this pattern very specifically in my mind at one point. I would have a very simple, clean internal impression. And then within seconds, my mind would start building commentary around it. Not because anything was wrong, but because the mind doesn't like leaving things unprocessed. It wants to complete the loop, it wants explanation, it wants resolution, even if the original moment didn't actually need one yet. And this is where things get a little tricky in spiritual development because you start learning that not every internal experience needs immediate interpretation, but your mind still behaves like it does. So you end up in this strange space where awareness notices something. The mind immediately responds, and then doubt enters during the response phase, not the perception phase. And people confuse that entire chain as I must not be intuitive enough. But that's not what's happening. It's more like my interpretation system is moving faster than my observation system. And honestly, that's very human. That's not a spiritual flaw. That's just how thinking works when it's active and engaged, especially if you're a reflective person or an analytical person or someone who's emotionally sensitive or all three at once, which is common. And I think one of the most overlooked parts of spiritual doubt is that it often comes from intelligence, not lack of intelligence, but active intelligence, a mind that is constantly trying to understand itself, constantly trying to refine accuracy, constantly trying to avoid being wrong. And that creates a kind of internal pressure that makes certainty feel like something you have to achieve immediately. So instead of I noticed something, it becomes I need to make sure I understood that correctly before I trust it. And that shift seems small, but internally it changes everything because now perception is no longer just perception. It becomes something you are evaluating in real time. And when you evaluate perception too quickly, doubt naturally increases because evaluation requires comparison, and comparison creates uncertainty, especially when there's no external reference point yet. So, what happens is you perceive something, you evaluate it immediately, you don't find external confirmation yet, and the mind fills that gap with doubt. Not because anything's wrong, but because the system is trying to stabilize itself. And I think this is where a lot of spiritual people start feeling like, why do I keep second guessing myself? But the more accurate question is, why am I trying to finalize meaning so quickly after I perceive something? That's the real mechanism underneath it. And I also want to say something here that I think is important because sometimes in spiritual spaces, there's this idea that confidence means never questioning yourself. But that's not grounded. Real confidence is not the absence of doubt, it's the ability to not collapse under it, to notice it without immediately obeying it, to let it exist without letting it rewrite your entire perception of yourself. And that takes time because most people are used to either trusting themselves fully without reflection or doubting themselves completely after reflection. And neither extreme creates stability. So, what we're really talking about here is learning a middle state where you can perceive something and not immediately destroy it with analysis, where you can notice something and not instantly reject it if it doesn't come with proof, where you can say, I saw that, without immediately needing, let me prove that I saw that correctly. And that shift is subtle, but it's actually where self trust begins to rebuild, not through certainty, but through restraint. And I think that's where we'll go deeper into next, because the next layer is where sensitivity and self doubt start to merge in a way that confuses people even more. And this is usually where they start thinking something is wrong with them, when it's actually just unresolved interpretation habits. So, this is where it gets really interesting because most people assume sensitivity should make you more confident in what you perceive. Like, if I feel more, I must know more. But in reality, sensitivity often increases input, not certainty. And that changes everything internally. Because when you're sensitive, you're not just picking up on one thing at a time. You're picking up layers, subtle shifts, micro changes in tone, emotion, atmosphere, thought patterns, your own internal reactions, all at once. And your system is constantly filtering. Is this mine? Is this theirs? Is this intuition? Is this emotion? Is this memory? Is this imagination? And that filtering process can become very mentally active. And I think this is where people start misunderstanding themselves because they feel a lot internally. But instead of that creating trust, it creates more processing, more analysis, more checking, more internal questioning. And over time, that can start to feel like doubt. But it's not actually doubt in the traditional sense, it's overload. It's too much internal data being processed without enough grounding or slowing down. And I remember realizing something at one point that really changed how I understood this. It wasn't that I wasn't perceiving things clearly, it was that I was perceiving things faster than I was letting myself understand them. So my system would notice something, and before I even had time to sit with it, my mind had already labeled it, evaluated it, questioned it, and either accepted it or rejected it, all within seconds. And then I would wonder why I didn't feel confident. But confidence doesn't really grow in speed, it grows in space. Space to observe, space to let things land, space to notice without immediately interfering. And sensitive people often don't give themselves that space, not because they're doing something wrong, but because they're used to feeling everything at once. So, stillness can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because in stillness, perception becomes clearer. And suddenly, you can't rely on distraction or speed to move past uncertainty anymore. And I think this is why a lot of sensitive people unintentionally become self critical because they start judging their internal reactions in real time instead of just noticing them. So instead of, I felt something, it becomes, why did I feel that? Was that right? Should I have felt that? What does that mean about me? And now the original experience is gone. And that's left. And what's left is analysis. And analysis isn't wrong, but it's not always the right tool for the first moment of perception because analysis comes after observation, not during it. And this is where self doubt quietly starts building because every time you override your first impression too quickly, you begin to trust it less. Not because it was wrong, but because you never gave it enough time to prove itself internally. And I think this is something people don't realize enough. Self trust isn't built by being correct all the time, it's built by not abandoning your perception immediately, even when you're unsure, even when it feels subtle, even when it doesn't come with instant confirmation. And sensitive people often abandon their first impressions very quickly because they've been taught, either directly or indirectly, that certainty should be immediate, that clarity should be obvious, that if something is real, you shouldn't question it. That's not how internal awareness actually develops because subtle perception needs time. It needs repetition. It needs comparison over experience, not instant judgment. And I think what happens is sensitive people feel something real internally, but because it doesn't arrive in a loud or dramatic way, they assume it's less valid. So they discount it. And then later, when it turns out to have been accurate, they feel confused about themselves. And that confusion slowly turns into doubt, not because they lack ability, but because they lack trust in subtlety. And honestly, subtlety is where most real intuitive awareness lives. It's not loud, it's not always dramatic, it's not always emotionally intense. And a lot of time, it's just quiet recognition, almost easy to miss if you're expecting something bigger. And I think part of the spiritual journey is learning to stop waiting for intensity as confirmation, because intensity is not the same as accuracy. Sometimes intensity is just emotion. Sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's excitement, sometimes it's projection, sometimes it's just nervous system activation. So if you rely on intensity as your marker for truth, you will eventually confuse yourself. Almost everyone does at some point. And this is why grounded development becomes so important. Because grounded development teaches you slow down enough to notice what's actually happening before deciding what it means, which sounds simple, but is actually a huge internal shift. And when you start doing that consistently, something very interesting happens. Your sensitivity doesn't disappear, your awareness doesn't shut down, but your reaction to it changes. And that's where self trust begins to stabilize, not through certainty, but through patience with your own perception. And next, we're going to go into something really important: how emotional identity and past experiences start shaping doubt without people realizing it. Because that layer is often the one that makes people think their intuition is wrong when it actually isn't. So, this is the layer that people don't always connect right away. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. Your self doubt is not only about your perception, it's also about your history. Because the way you interpret your awareness is influenced by how you were taught to trust yourself growing up, whether your perceptions were validated or dismissed, how safe it felt to be right, how safe it felt to be wrong, whether you were encouraged to question yourself or silence yourself. So now, when you perceive something as an adult, you're not just perceiving it in the present moment, you're also processing it through past experiences, emotional memory, identity patterns, subconscious beliefs about trust and correctedness. And I think this is why some people immediately doubt themselves, even when something feels clear, because somewhere in their system, there's a learned response that says, don't trust that too quickly. And that response didn't come from nowhere. It usually came from repeated experiences where they were told they were wrong, their perception wasn't validated, their sensitivity was dismissed, or they learned that trusting themselves created discomfort. So now the system is trying to protect itself, not by shutting down perception, but by questioning it constantly. And honestly, that's not weakness, that's adaptation. It's your system trying to keep you safe based on what it learned before. But the problem is that protective pattern doesn't always update automatically when your awareness grows. So now you have expanded perception, increased sensitivity, deeper awareness, but still the same internal rule. Don't trust yourself too quickly. And that creates tension because one part of you is noticing more than ever before, and another part is still holding onto an older way of protecting you. And I remember realizing at one point that some of my doubt wasn't coming from what I was perceiving. It was coming from how quickly I was taught to question myself after perceiving something. That was the pattern, not the perception itself, the reaction to it. And that distinction matters because if you don't see that, you start thinking, my intuition must not be clear. When really it's my system is interrupting clarity out of habit. And I think this is where a lot of people get stuck because they keep trying to improve their perception when what actually needs attention is their relationship to their perception. Because you can be very intuitive and still not trust yourself. Those two things are not automatically linked. And honestly, I think this is why some of the most perceptive people are also the most self questioning because they've developed awareness but haven't yet restructured the internal trust system that supports it. And this is also where and this is also where emotional identity comes in. Because if you see yourself as someone who overthinks, someone who is too emotional, someone who gets things wrong, someone who is unsure, then every experience you have will be filtered through that identity. So instead of I noticed something, it becomes I noticed something, but I'm probably overthinking. And that but changes everything because now your perception is immediately being discounted, not based on the experience itself, but based on who you believe you are. And I think this is one of the deeper parts of development that people don't always expect because it's not just about learning to perceive, it's about learning to trust the one who is perceiving, which is you. And this is where things can start to shift in a very real, practical way. Because once you recognize that doubt is coming from a learned pattern, not necessarily from your perception itself, you can begin to change how you respond in the moment. Not perfectly, but intentionally. And I think this is important. Rebuilding self trust is not about forcing yourself to believe everything you perceive. It's about not immediately dismissing it. There's a difference because what most people do is this they notice something and within seconds they override it. They explain it away, they minimize it, they replace it with something more logical or more acceptable. And it happens so fast, they don't even realize they're doing it. So the first step is actually very simple. Not easy, but simple. When you notice something, pause just for a second. And instead of immediately questioning it, just acknowledge that was my first impression. That's it. You don't need to label it yet. You don't need to prove it. You don't need to explain it. Just let it exist, because that first layer before all the mental noise is often the clearest one. Not always perfect, but clean. And I remember when I started doing this, it felt almost uncomfortable. But because I was so used to immediately analyzing everything, immediately correcting myself, immediately trying to get it right, so just letting something sit without touching it felt unnatural at first. But over time, something started changing. I began noticing patterns, not instantly, but consistently. I would have an initial impression, leave it alone, and then later see how it played out. And that's where trust actually starts building, not in the moment of perception, but in the reflection afterward. Because then you start seeing, oh, that first feeling was actually accurate. And that recognition builds confidence naturally without forcing it. And I think this is where people go wrong. They try to build confidence in the moment, but confidence is actually built over time through evidence you observe yourself. And that requires patience, which I know is not the most exciting answer, but that's the real one. And this is something I really want to emphasize. You do not need to eliminate self doubt completely. That's not the goal, because doubt in small amounts is actually part of discernment. It helps you not jump to conclusions too quickly. It helps you stay grounded. It helps you question things when necessary. The issue is not doubt itself, it's when doubt becomes automatic, constant, unquestioned. When every single thing you perceive is immediately followed by, that's probably wrong. That's when it becomes a problem. So instead of trying to remove doubt entirely, the shift is learning to not immediately believe it. Let it be there, but don't let it take over. Don't let it rewrite your perception instantly. You can notice something and also notice doubt without letting the doubt cancel everything out. That's a very different internal experience. So, this is something I wish someone had explained in a very normal, grounded way earlier. You do not need to eliminate doubt. And honestly, you won't, not completely. And I think people come into spiritual development with this idea that once I'm intuitive enough, I'll just know everything. No hesitation, no questioning, no second guessing, just walking through life like, yes, that is correct. Thank you. Which would be nice, but that's not how the human mind works at all. Because you are still human. You still have a brain. You still have memory, emotion, pattern recognition, fear, logic, all running at the same time. So the goal is not remove doubt entirely. The goal is change your relationship to it. And that's a very different conversation because right now, what most people do is they perceive something and then doubt shows up, and the doubt immediately wins every time. No hesitation, no discussion, no observation, just, oh, okay, doubt is here. That must be the truth. I used to do this constantly. I didn't even realize I was doing it. It was automatic. I would notice something very clearly and then within seconds, no, that's probably not right. And I would move on. Like the first part never even happened. And when you do that over and over again, you train your system to trust doubt more than perception. And that's where people get stuck because then they start thinking, why can't I trust myself? But the real question is, why am I trusting doubt immediately without questioning it? Because doubt feels intelligent. That's the tricky part. It sounds reasonable. It sounds cautious. It sounds like we're just being careful. But sometimes it's not actually being careful. Sometimes it's just being conditioned. And I think once I realized that, everything started shifting because I stopped treating doubt like authority and started treating it like, okay, that's one voice in the room, not the only voice. And that's a very different internal experience because now it becomes I notice something and I also feel doubt about it instead of I notice something, but the doubt cancels it. And that word, But is important because it replaces the entire experience. So, one small shift that helped me a lot was changing but to and. So, instead of I felt something, but I'm probably wrong, it becomes I felt something and I'm noticing doubt. That keeps both things visible instead of letting one erase the other. And I know that sounds simple, but internally, it changes everything because now you're not abandoning your perception immediately. You're just noticing what's happening. And over time, you start realizing something really interesting. Doubt shows up even when you're right. That's the part people don't expect. They think, if this were accurate, I wouldn't doubt it. That's not true. You can be completely accurate and still have a moment of, wait, what was, wait, was that right? Because doubt is not always a signal of inaccuracy. Sometimes it's just a habit. Sometimes it's just your mind doing what it's always done. And once you see that, you stop taking it so personally. It's not something is wrong with me. It's, oh, that pattern is still running. And that's a much calmer place to be. And honestly, I think trying to eliminate doubt completely actually makes things worse because then people start fighting themselves internally. They think, I shouldn't feel doubt. And now you have perception, doubt, and resistance to doubt all happening at the same time, which is a lot. Instead, it becomes much easier when you allow doubt to exist without letting it take control. Like, okay, doubt is here. That's fine. I'm still going to observe what I noticed. That's grounded, that's stable, that's realistic. And over time, something really subtle starts happening. You stop reacting to doubt as urgently. It doesn't feel as loud, it doesn't feel as convincing. Not because it disappeared, but because you stopped giving it immediate authority. And I think that's the real shift, not elimination, repositioning. Doubt goes from this must be true to this is something I'm noticing. And that's where discernment starts building naturally. And honestly, that makes this whole process feel a lot less intense because you're not trying to be perfect anymore. You're just learning how to observe yourself more honestly. And that is actually what leads to confidence over time, not forcing certainty, not eliminating doubt, but not letting it run everything anymore. So now that we've talked about doubt, this is where people usually expect a very specific outcome. They think, okay, so once I get past this, I'll finally feel confident. And what they mean by that is certain all the time, clear all the time, no hesitation, no second guessing, no internal questioning, basically spiritually unshakable. And I get why people expect that because that's how confidence is usually presented. Very solid, very definitive, very, I know, and that's it. But real self trust, especially in intuitive or spiritual development, does not feel like that. Not in the way people imagine. It's actually much quieter, much more subtle, much more normal. Self trust doesn't feel like I know everything. It feels like I'm not abandoning myself anymore. And that's a very different internal experience. Because what most people do, and this is important, they abandon themselves very quickly. They notice something and then almost immediately dismiss it, question it, replace it, override it, or talk themselves out of it. And it happens so fast. It feels like one motion. And they walk away thinking, I didn't really feel anything. But they did. They just didn't stay with it long enough to recognize it. And that's where self trust actually begins. Not in becoming more powerful, but in becoming more willing to stay with your own perception. And I remember when this started shifting for me, it didn't feel like confidence, it felt like restraint. Like I had the impulse to immediately analyze something, and I didn't. I just let it sit there. And that felt uncomfortable at first because I was so used to figuring things out immediately, making sense of everything instantly, correcting myself in real time. So doing less felt like I was doing something wrong. It felt like, shouldn't I be deciding what this means right now? And the answer was no, not yet. Because that moment, right after you perceive something, is not the time to finalize meaning. It's the time to observe. And over time, those small moments of observation start building something very stable internally. You notice something, you don't immediately shut it down. You let it exist. You come back to it later and you start seeing patterns. And that's where trust actually builds, not in one moment of certainty, but in repeated moments of recognition. And I think this is something people don't realize enough. Self trust is not built through intensity, it's built through repetition. Repeated moments of, I noticed something and I didn't dismiss it. Repeated moments of, I stayed with that a little longer than I normally would. Repeated moments of, I allowed that to exist without immediately correcting it. And those moments don't feel dramatic. They don't feel like breakthroughs. They don't feel like, this is it. I'm finally confident. They feel small, almost unnoticeable at first. But over time, they create a very different internal environment. You stop reacting to yourself so quickly. You stop interrupting your own awareness. You stop assuming you're wrong before anything has even had time to unfold. And that creates space. And in that space, clarity starts becoming more visible. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped interfering with it constantly. And I think another important part of self trust is this: you stop needing everything to feel intense in order to believe it. Because in the beginning, people often trust what feels strongest, what feels most emotional, what feels most overwhelming, what feels most obvious. But over time, you start noticing that some of the clearest things are actually the calmest. They don't come with urgency, they don't come with pressure, they don't come with emotional intensity attached. They just exist quietly. And if you're used to intensity, that can feel almost too subtle to trust. So part of self trust is also learning to recognize calm does not mean inaccurate. And that's a big shift because now you're not looking for what feels the strongest. You're noticing what feels consistent. And consistency is much more reliable than intensity. And I think this is where people start feeling more stable internally because they're no longer chasing emotional confirmation all the time. They're just observing what continues to show up, what stays, what remains clear even after emotion settles in. And that creates a much deeper kind of trust. Not loud, not performative, not something you need to prove, just steady. And honestly, that's what people are actually looking for. Even if they think they want certainty, they want to feel stable in their own awareness, not constantly questioning themselves, not constantly overriding themselves, not constantly feeling like they're getting it wrong. And self trust gives you that, not perfectly, but increasingly. And over time, something really shifts. And you stop asking, am I right? And start noticing, what am I actually experiencing? And that question is much more useful because it keeps you connected to observation instead of pulling you into constant self judgment. And honestly, that's where this whole process becomes a lot less exhausting because you're no longer fighting yourself all the time. You're just learning how to stay with yourself a little longer than you used to. And that alone changes everything. So when you take all of this together, the doubt, the sensitivity, the overthinking, the identity patterns, the hesitation, what you start to realize is something very simple, but very important. Most of this was never about a lack of ability. It was about a lack of trust in your own experience. And those are not the same thing because you can be highly aware, highly perceptive, very intuitive, and still feel unsure. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because your system learned at some point not to fully rely on itself. And that learning doesn't just disappear automatically when your awareness grows. It has to be updated gently over time through experience. And I think that's the part people don't expect. They think development is going to feel like gaining something new, but a lot of the time, it actually feels like removing interference, removing the immediate self doubt, removing the constant correction, removing the habit of dismissing yourself too quickly. And what's left is not something new, it's something that was already there, just finally being allowed to exist without interruption. And I think one of the biggest shifts that happens, and it's subtle, is this: you are trying to finalize everything immediately. Because in the beginning, everything feels urgent. Every thought feels important. Every feeling feels like it needs to be understood right away. Every perception feels like it needs a conclusion. And that urgency creates pressure, and pressure creates distortion. But over time, you start realizing not everything needs to be decided right now. You can notice something and let it be incomplete. You can feel something and not immediately explain it. You can perceive something and allow understanding to unfold later. And that creates space. And in that space, your awareness actually becomes clearer. Not because you tried harder, but because you stopped rushing the process. And honestly, I think a lot of people are not lacking clarity. They're just overwhelming their own clarity with urgency, trying to figure everything out immediately, validate everything instantly, understand everything at once. And when you stop doing that, even just a little, things begin to settle. And I want to say this too, because I think it matters. If you've been doubting yourself, that doesn't mean you're behind. It doesn't mean you're blocked. It doesn't mean you're not intuitive. It usually means you're in a phase where your awareness is expanding and your trust system is still catching up. And that's a very normal place to be, even if it doesn't feel comfortable. And that gap between awareness and trust is where most people either push too hard, shut themselves down, or start thinking something is wrong. But nothing is wrong. There's just a misalignment that hasn't stabilized yet. And that stabilization happens through exactly what we talked about today. Not immediately dismissing yourself, allowing perception to exist before analyzing it, noticing doubt without obeying it, slowing down your internal reactions, and giving your awareness space to show you what it's actually doing. Not perfectly, but consistently. And over time, something very grounding starts to happen. You begin to feel more steady, not because you have all the answers, but because you're not constantly questioning your own experience anymore. And that steadiness is what people are actually searching for, even more than certainty. Because certainty comes and goes, but stability, that stays. And honestly, once you feel that even a little bit, everything about this process becomes easier, less overwhelming, less intense, less confusing. Not because awareness disappears, but because you're no longer fighting it all the time. So if you take anything from this episode, let it be this: You don't need to become someone else to trust yourself. You just need to stop abandoning yourself so quickly in the moments where you already notice something. Start there. That's enough. Thank you for being here with me today. If this resonated with you, you can continue your development through Alpha Mediumship Academy using the link in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to follow the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. And just remember, you're probably perceiving more clearly than you think. You're just learning how to trust it. Until next time, stay aware, stay grounded, and trust yourself a little more than you did yesterday.